Some say General Milley, who will step down as chairman at the end of this week, helped save America's democracy. Donald Trump says he was a train wreck who in times gone by would have been executed for his behavior. Joining us now is former defense secretary in the Trump administration and the author of A Sacred Oath, Memoirs of a Secretary of Defense During Extraordinary Times, Mark Esper. Extraordinary times indeed. Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for joining us. I know you worked alongside General Milley, and you were there in the room with him during a lot of those final moments during the Trump administration. How do you see his legacy?
Look, I think it's a very strong legacy of a military officer, a man who served his country well for over 40-plus years and during some of the most difficult, if not the most difficult times in our nation's history. And I know that because I lived and worked through that alongside him. So I think he has a very noble history and a great story to tell. And he was critical to being one of many circuit breakers in what could have gone really bad, worse than what we saw, actually.
Well, explain that.
Well, look, as I commented in a couple articles, Milley was a great advisor and partner to me during my tenure there. And side by side, we had to address any number of issues. Most notably, of course, was the president's desire to use active duty troops against protesters in Lafayette Square. So it was pushing back on things like that, or an eagerness among him or aides around him to attack countries or, conduct other types of operations. I've described, of course, in my memoir that you mentioned, the president's interest in striking cartels with missiles in Mexico. But there are any number of things where Milley and I were side by side, and he played the professional, responsible role that he did, providing advice to me and to the president as well during, again, those very tumultuous times.
So I mentioned in the lead-in to you, Donald Trump saying that in times gone by he would have been executed for some of his behavior. And what we're talking about specifically is the calls that he made to China in the final days of the administration, with the election and all the tumult surrounding that. Explain what he was doing. And why that mattered, and why Donald Trump might be so angry about it.
Well, first of all, that statement by the president is horrible. It's intolerable. It should be condemned by everybody, right, left, Republican, Democrat, right? Mark Milley served his country well, did it professionally, and we owe him a great deal of gratitude. I do as well. And so part of this is a lot of misinformation. I think in some case, inaccuracies or incomplete stories that came out of some of the books were published at the time. One of the two events that I think the president referenced was a call he made to China in October 2020, where he warned them, if you will. And I think the allegation is that he gave them information or something. But what's often not told is the other part of the story that I describe in quite some detail in my book, that I had reached out to the Chinese 2 weeks beforehand because I was concerned about what was happening, about what we were picking up in intelligence and in open sources and from private parties about the Chinese concerned and troubled by what they were seeing. And my view was I did not want a mishap, an imperception to lead to some type of conflict in the South China Sea between the United States and China. That's the last we wanted. And it was in a subsequent meeting that I directed General Milley to reach out to his counterpart as well, to send the same message that nothing going on here, that we have no aims against you, that it's going to be steady as she goes. And that was what we did typically in these types of situations. He conveyed that message, but somehow it got portrayed that he was a rogue general acting on his own and sent wrong messages to the Chinese. And again, it's just an incomplete story. Mark Milley did what I directed him to do. He did what other chairmen had done in the past, which I think is responsible diplomacy and statecraft to prevent mishaps from happening.
What about a former president saying things like, he should have been executed, or in times gone by, he would have been executed?
It's terrible. Again, it should be condemned. We owe Mark Milley and his predecessors and all those uniformed officers, men and women alike, who served before and especially during the Trump administration, a debt of gratitude for what they do. Look, they spend 40-plus years of their lives moving around 20-plus times in war and peace, dragging their families around. Spouses can't get jobs. It's a tough life. And it's a tough life lived by their families. And we owe them, again, a debt of gratitude and thanks for their service, not condemnation, and certainly not that type of rhetoric coming out of no less than the President of the United States.
So Milley steps down at the end of the week, certainly leaving a more stable administration behind, but not necessarily a more stable world. You were just in Taiwan recently. What do you see as the biggest threat? Is it Taiwan? Is it China's incursion into that island? Or is it what we're seeing with Russia and Ukraine?
It's a dangerous world right now. Katie, we have a hot war in Europe, and it looks like a cold one emerging in Asia, particularly in the Northeast Asia between China and Taiwan. And you're right, I was just there. They're very concerned. They're making a number of important moves. President Tsai is returning conscription to 1 year, stockpiling arms, making other things. And the Chinese rhetoric continues to increase. There are nearly daily incursions of Chinese aircraft and ships into Taiwan's air defense identification zones and territorial waters. And so I see things escalating, and it gets even more dangerous today when we see China's economy slowly collapsing, right? And the concern is, will it get so bad in China domestically, economically, with everything else going on, youth unemployment above 20%? Will they lash out against Taiwan in order to distract the people? So I think it's incumbent upon the United States and other democracies in the world that support Taiwan to believe that the democracies of the world should push back against the autocracies of the world to stand firm with our Taiwanese partners.
Your picture froze, so forgive us for. Oh, you're back there. Good. Do you see us getting into a war with China, getting involved in a war, boots on the ground with China over Taiwan?
I don't think it's inevitable, and it's certainly not imminent. Obviously, President Xi Jinping has set out a timeline for the People's Liberation Army to be ready to do something against China by 2027. The Taiwanese will have a very important election in January of next year, which the Chinese are not happy about the leading a candidate. So, look, I think this is something we have to act in unison about to continue to maintain a high state of deterrence against China waking up one morning and deciding to do the wrong thing, because it would be terrible for our two countries. It'd be terrible for the global economy. And so what we need to do is to prevent war from acting. And look, I'm a Reagan Republican, so I believe in peace through strength. But it's not just the military. It's diplomacy. It's economics. And really, it's our partners around the world working together with us.
Well, so here's the burning question. We're a year and a couple months away from an election where Donald Trump wants to be the president again. Do you see that as a good thing, a bad thing, scary? How do you view it?
Well, I'm very troubled by it. I said before that I think he's a threat to democracy and certainly the institutions of our great republic. And I'm very concerned. I want to see a new leader from the Republican Party.
What about militarily?
I want to see a new.
I'm sorry? What about militarily with the conflict, potential conflict with China and Taiwan? What about with Ukraine in terms of that aspect of a second Donald Trump term?
Yeah, look, I'm very concerned that what he'll do early on is pull U.S. support from Ukraine. And if that happens, then I think support writ large for Ukraine crumbles. I've always been concerned that he withdraw U.S. forces from NATO. Both those things would send all the wrong messages to Beijing and maybe encourage them to act against Taiwan. So, look, we can go around the globe and talk about every country where I have a concern about this, because I lived through it for 18 months or so alongside, once again, Chairman Mark Milley. So, yeah, I have a lot of concerns here.